She was born into a family that America refused to see as mortal. In photographs, the world remembers a small girl wandering the halls of the White House, her presence softening power into something almost tender. The illusion was effortless. Youth beside authority, innocence beside history. It looked like safety. It looked like permanence. But nothing inside the Kennedy orbit was ever meant to last. Before she could understand language, her life had already been written in symbols, her name tied not to a future, but to a narrative. She was not simply a daughter. She was a continuation, a living fragment of something the nation needed to believe in, even as it was already beginning to fracture. The tragedy was not that loss would come. It was that the world would expect her to carry it quietly. And long before she could remember her father's voice, before she could question what it meant to belong to the Kennedy family, one truth had already settled around her like architecture. She would never be allowed to be ordinary. So the question was never whether her life would break, but whether it would ever truly belong to her at all. Long before Caroline Kennedy was born, the family she would inherit had already learned how to survive by refusing to feel. The Kennedy family did not begin as myth. It began as construction. At the center of that construction stood Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., a man who understood power not as an outcome, but as a system that could be engineered. Wealth was accumulated with precision. Influence was negotiated, traded, and expanded. But more importantly, identity itself was curated. The Kennedys were not simply a family. They were a project. And like any project, they required discipline. Emotion, in this architecture, was inefficient. Joseph Kennedy did not raise children in the traditional sense. He developed them. Each son was assigned a trajectory long before adulthood, each daughter positioned within a broader social calculus. Success was not encouraged. It was expected, demanded, and silently monitored. Approval existed, but it was conditional. Love, if it appeared at all, was filtered through achievement. At his side, Rose Kennedy maintained a different kind of order, quieter, more devout, but no less rigid. Her world was structured by Catholic discipline and emotional restraint. Where Joseph imposed ambition, Rose enforced composure. Together, they created a household where appearances mattered more than inner life, where suffering was not to be expressed but absorbed. This combination would become the defining language of the family. Perform, endure, do not reveal. It is often said that dynasties are built on vision. But the Kennedy dynasty was sustained by something more fragile, suppression. And suppression has a cost. Before the world would ever speak of a Kennedy curse, there were already fractures forming beneath the surface. The eldest daughter, Rosemary, whose struggles did not fit the family's narrative of perfection, was quietly removed from public life after a lobotomy, an intervention that was less about healing than about control. Her absence became a silence that the family never acknowledged, a warning encoded into the structure. Deviation would not be tolerated. The sons, meanwhile, were prepared for visibility, but not for vulnerability. John F. Kennedy, the second eldest son, would eventually become the most visible expression of his father's ambitions. But even his rise was shaped by loss. The original heir, Joseph Kennedy Jr., died during World War II, and with his death, expectation shifted, quietly but completely, onto John. He was not meant to be the chosen one. He became it because someone else could no longer fulfill the role. This pattern, of identity reassigned through tragedy, would repeat itself across generations. By the time John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, the family had perfected its public image. Youth, charisma, and elegance were presented not just as personal qualities, but as national symbols. The presidency was not merely political power, it was theater. And at the center of that theater stood Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, whose refinement and restraint helped transform the administration into something resembling mythology. They called it Camelot. It suggested a kingdom without decay, a moment suspended above history. But Camelot, as legend reminds us, is defined not by its glory, but by its fall. Inside this carefully constructed world, reality was more complicated. John F. Kennedy carried chronic illness, concealed from the public, his physical fragility masked by controlled appearances. Jacqueline Kennedy, often portrayed as distant and composed, navigated grief and isolation long before the world associated her with tragedy. Their marriage, while iconic, was marked by emotional distance, shaped by expectations that left little room for authenticity. But none of this disrupted the image. Because in the Kennedy system, image was not a reflection of truth. It was a replacement for it. By the early 1960s, the family had achieved what Joseph Kennedy had envisioned decades earlier: proximity to power so complete that it blurred into identity. The nation did not simply elect a president, it adopted a family. And with that adoption came a collective illusion. Americans saw youth and assumed safety. They saw beauty and assumed stability. They saw continuity and assumed permanence. But the family itself had been built on conditions that made permanence impossible. Every success carried the weight of expectation. Every role was inherited, not chosen. Every individual was, in some way, replaceable, because the dynasty itself was the only thing that could not be allowed to fail. It is within this structure that Caroline Kennedy would be born in 1957. But by then, the emotional climate of her world had already been determined. She would not enter a family learning how to love. She would enter a family that had learned how to endure. And endurance, when passed down through generations, does not protect. It isolates. Because when vulnerability is treated as weakness and silence as strength, the next generation does not inherit resilience. They inherit distance. For Caroline, this distance would not feel like absence. It would feel like normality. The absence of open grief. The absence of emotional language. The absence of visible fracture. All of it would be absorbed before she had the capacity to question it. And perhaps that is where the quiet inevitability begins, not in the moment of tragedy, but in the conditions that make tragedy impossible to process when it arrives. By the time the world would come to remember her as a symbol of loss, the framework for that loss had already been constructed decades earlier. Not by fate, but by design. Childhood, in most lives, is where identity begins. For Caroline Kennedy, it was where identity was quietly replaced. Inside the White House, her presence was framed as something almost storybook: small footsteps echoing through historic corridors, a child's laughter softening the machinery of power. The image was irresistible. A young girl with a pony on the south lawn. A brother beside her. A mother composed. A father luminous. It looked like innocence. But innocence, in this environment, was not something she was allowed to keep. From the beginning, her existence was observed, photographed, interpreted. She was not just living inside history, she was being recorded as part of it. Every gesture, every appearance, became part of a narrative she had no control over. Before she could understand what it meant to be seen, she had already been made visible. And visibility, in the Kennedy world, was never neutral. It came with expectation. Her father, John F. Kennedy, occupied not only the presidency, but a symbolic role that extended beyond politics. To the public, he represented vitality, intelligence, and national optimism. But inside the family, his presence was more fragmented, frequently absent, often distant, shaped by the demands of power and the private realities he kept concealed. For a child, absence does not announce itself as neglect. It simply becomes the structure of attachment. Caroline did not grow up questioning why her father was not always there. She grew up adapting to it, learning, quietly, that closeness was conditional. That attention came in moments, not as a constant. That love, like everything else in her world, was subject to interruption. Her mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, offered a different form of presence, one defined by control rather than accessibility. Jacqueline was attentive in ways that were precise, almost curated. She shaped her children's environment with care, surrounding them with art, literature, and a sense of cultural refinement. But emotional openness was not part of that design. Jacqueline's own life had taught her the value of composure. She understood how to maintain an image under scrutiny, how to move through public spaces without revealing private fractures. And this understanding, while protective, also created distance. For Caroline, affection was rarely unstructured. It was mediated through routine, through expectation, through the quiet understanding that certain emotions were not meant to be displayed. This was not cruelty. It was inheritance. The same emotional restraint that had defined previous generations now shaped her earliest experiences. The same silence, the same emphasis on endurance, the same unspoken rule, do not reveal more than necessary. And yet, for a brief moment, it seemed possible that her life might unfold differently. There were fragments of normalcy, moments that did not belong to the larger narrative. Playing with her brother, John F. Kennedy Jr., away from cameras. Small routines that felt private, even within a public space. A sense, however fragile, that childhood could exist alongside expectation. But these moments were temporary, because the environment she inhabited was not designed to protect them. On November 22, 1963, that reality became irreversible. Caroline Kennedy was 6 years old when her father was assassinated. The event itself has been analyzed, documented, and replayed endlessly in American history. But for a child, its meaning is not political. It is not historical. It is personal. It is the sudden, incomprehensible disappearance of a figure who was never fully present, yet still central. It is the transformation of absence into permanence. And more than that, it is the moment when private grief becomes public expectation. The images that followed would define not only the nation's memory, but Caroline's identity within it. The funeral, the procession, the quiet dignity expected of a family already accustomed to control. Her younger brother's salute, captured, repeated, immortalized. She stood within that frame, not as a child processing loss, but as part of a collective symbol of mourning. There was no space to be disoriented, no space to collapse, because the family did not collapse. They endured. And in enduring, they reinforced the pattern that had shaped them for decades. Tragedy is to be absorbed, not expressed. For Caroline, this meant that grief did not unfold in a natural progression. It did not move through stages or find release. Instead, it was integrated, quietly, deeply, into her sense of self. Loss became something familiar, not because it was understood, but because it was never fully addressed. In the years that followed, her life shifted away from the White House, but not away from scrutiny. The Kennedy name remained intact, carrying with it the same expectations, the same symbolic weight. She was no longer the president's daughter in residence, but she remained a figure through which the public continued to interpret the family story. And within the family itself, the structure remained unchanged. Silence persisted. Resilience was still defined as composure. Emotional survival still depended on containment. As she grew older, Caroline learned how to navigate this world with precision. She became private in ways that mirrored her mother, controlled in ways that aligned with the family's expectations. She avoided spectacle. She avoided excess visibility. She constructed a life that appeared stable, grounded, almost deliberately understated. But adaptation is not the same as freedom, because the conditions that shaped her had not disappeared. They had simply become internal. The absence of her father was no longer an external event. It was part of her emotional baseline. The restraint modeled by her mother was no longer something observed. It was something embodied. The pressure of the family name was no longer imposed. It was something she carried without needing to be reminded. And this is where the deeper tragedy begins to take form. Not in what was taken from her, but in what she learned to live without questioning. Because when a child is raised inside a system that normalizes distance, that equates silence with strength, that transforms loss into identity, they do not grow up searching for something different. They grow up protecting what they have been given, even if what they have been given is incomplete, even if it leaves parts of them unformed. By the time Caroline Kennedy reached adulthood, she would appear composed, intelligent, and self-contained, a reflection of the very system that had shaped her. But beneath that composure was something less visible. a life that had been structured around absence, a sense of self that had been defined, not by choice, but by inheritance, and a question that would remain unspoken. If you are taught from the beginning not to need too much, how do you ever recognize what is missing? Control, in the Kennedy world, was never about freedom. It was about containment. By the time Caroline Kennedy entered adulthood, she had already mastered the language of restraint so completely that it no longer appeared learned. It appeared inherent. Where other members of her family moved through visibility with a kind of combustible intensity, she moved differently, quietly, deliberately, as if aware that attention itself carried a cost. In a dynasty defined by spectacle, she chose absence. And that choice, at first glance, looked like autonomy. She pursued education with discipline, attending Radcliffe College and later immersing herself in intellectual and cultural work that existed just outside the center of political theater. Her interests, law, literature, public service, suggested continuity with the Kennedy legacy, but without its volatility. She did not reject the system she was born into. She refined her place within it. Her marriage to Edwin Schlossberg in 1986 reinforced this impression of stability. He was not a political figure, not a symbol, not someone whose identity threatened to merge with the weight of her name. The union appeared, from the outside, to offer something rare within the Kennedy narrative, a life that might remain intact. 3 children followed. A home that was, by all visible measures, grounded. A rhythm that suggested distance from the patterns that had defined previous generations. But appearances, within this family, have always been carefully managed. Because control is most convincing when it looks natural. What Caroline constructed was not an escape from the Kennedy system. It was a quieter version of it. The same expectations remained, only less visible. The same inheritance persisted, only more internalized. She became, in many ways, the ideal adaptation of the dynasty's evolution. Where earlier generations had embodied charisma, she embodied discretion. Where they had drawn attention, she absorbed it. Where they had lived publicly, she lived in proximity to the public without fully entering it. This balance, between presence and distance, gave the impression that she had succeeded where others had not. That she had found a way to exist within the Kennedy legacy without being consumed by it. But this impression depended on one assumption: that silence equals stability. And silence, as the family had demonstrated for decades, is not the absence of fracture. It is the concealment of it. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Kennedy narrative continued to unfold around her. Scandals, tragedies, public fascination, these elements did not disappear. They simply shifted focus. Other members of the family occupied the spotlight, carrying forward the volatility that had always existed beneath the surface. Caroline remained on the periphery, composed, measured, untouched, at least in appearance. But proximity, even without direct involvement, is not neutral, because the family system does not release its members simply because they step back. It follows them. And in 1999, the distance she had constructed was tested in a way that echoed the past with unsettling precision. Her brother, John F. Kennedy Jr., the same child who had once stood beside her in the White House, who had shared those brief moments of unstructured childhood, died in a plane crash. The event, like the assassination decades earlier, became immediate public history. But for Caroline, it was something else. It was repetition. Another loss that did not arrive unexpectedly, but still felt impossible to process. Another moment where private grief was absorbed into a public narrative. Another confirmation that within this family, continuity often took the form of recurrence. And perhaps most significantly, it altered her position within the dynasty. She was no longer simply a daughter, no longer simply a sister. She became something more singular. The remaining link to a generation that had been defined, almost entirely, by its disappearance. From the outside, she responded as she always had, with composure, with restraint, with an absence of visible collapse. The same language she had learned as a child now functioned as her primary method of survival. But survival, in this context, carries its own weight, because each act of endurance reinforces the system that requires it. Each moment of controlled grief deepens the pattern of silence. Each decision to remain composed narrows the space for anything else. By the early 2000s, Caroline Kennedy had become, in the public imagination, something close to stable permanence, a figure who had outlasted the volatility of her family, who had preserved its dignity without replicating its chaos. She moved into roles that reflected this perception: cultural leadership, philanthropy, eventually, diplomatic service, representing the United States in a capacity that aligned with both her lineage and her restraint. It looked, unmistakably, like control, a life that had been shaped by trauma, yet not defined by visible fracture, a narrative that suggested resilience, adaptation, even quiet success. But this is where the illusion becomes most complete, because control, when it is built on early conditioning, is not a choice. It is a continuation. Caroline did not step outside the Kennedy system. She perfected its final form, a version where the noise had been reduced, the spectacle minimized, the instability contained beneath layers of discipline and privacy. And in doing so, she fulfilled the expectation that had existed long before she could understand it: to carry the legacy forward. Not loudly, but without interruption. Yet within that fulfillment lies the unresolved tension that defines her life. Because a life that is carefully controlled is not necessarily a life that is freely lived. And a role that is performed without visible strain may still be shaped by pressures that never disappear. By the time she reached this point, respected, composed, enduring, one question remained, unspoken but persistent. Was this stability the result of choice, or simply the most refined expression of everything she had been taught not to feel? There are lives that fracture suddenly, and there are lives that are offered, briefly, the possibility of becoming something else, only to return, almost imperceptibly, to the path they were always on. For Caroline Kennedy, that possibility did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a series of absences. Absence of visibility, absence of obligation, absence, even, of expectation, at least in its most obvious forms. After the death of her brother, the structure around her shifted in a way that could have allowed for something unprecedented within the Kennedy narrative: withdrawal. Not the temporary distance she had always maintained, but a complete disengagement. A life beyond the symbolic weight of her name. A private existence that did not require her to carry forward the mythology of a family that had already taken so much. For the first time, the role was not clearly defined. There was no immediate successor to replace her. No brother stepping into visibility. No parallel figure absorbing the public's attention. The narrative, in a sense, paused. And within that pause, there was space. Space to step away. Space to refuse. Space to let the Kennedy legacy, as a lived obligation, end with her generation. This was the exit. But exits, in families like hers, are rarely recognized as such, because the forces that define identity do not announce themselves when they tighten. They are internal, familiar, indistinguishable from instinct. What appears to be choice is often continuity, unfolding with such subtlety that it feels inevitable. Caroline Kennedy did not publicly declare a decision to remain. She simply did not leave. She continued to appear, carefully, selectively, but consistently, within the structures that had always defined her world. She participated in preserving her father's legacy, in maintaining the institutions and narratives that sustained the image of Camelot. She remained connected to political life, to cultural leadership, to the quiet responsibilities that accompany a name like hers. From the outside, this looked measured, balanced, reasonable. But the question is not whether her actions were rational. The question is why the alternative never fully materialized. Because to leave would not have been a simple act of relocation. It would have required a redefinition of self that her upbringing had never prepared her for. From the beginning, her identity had been relational: daughter, sister, inheritor. Her sense of purpose had been structured around continuity, not deviation. Even her privacy, which appeared to separate her from the family's more visible patterns, functioned within that same framework. She was not outside the system. She was its most stable component. To exit would have meant confronting something far more destabilizing than public scrutiny: the absence of inherited meaning. What does a life look like when it is no longer anchored to legacy? What replaces a role that has existed since birth? For someone raised to endure, not to question, these are not abstract considerations. They are psychological thresholds. And thresholds, once internalized, are rarely crossed. There is also the matter of loyalty. Not the overt, declarative kind, but the quieter form that is embedded through repetition. The understanding that one does not abandon the family narrative, especially after witnessing its cost. That survival carries with it an implicit obligation, not to escape, but to preserve. Caroline had seen what happened when the structure fractured. She had lived through the absence of her father, the loss of her brother, the accumulation of grief that had defined her generation. To step away entirely might have felt, not like liberation, but like erasure, as though leaving would invalidate the endurance that had come before. And so, the exit remained theoretical, a possibility that existed only in contrast to the life she continued to live. Instead, she moved deeper into roles that aligned with her conditioning. Public service, yes, but in forms that emphasized diplomacy over visibility, influence over exposure. She became the custodian of memory, the figure through whom the Kennedy legacy could persist without reigniting its more volatile expressions. It was, in many ways, the most logical outcome. And that is precisely what makes it tragic. Because the missed exit was not dramatic. There was no clear moment of refusal, no visible turning point where a different path was consciously abandoned. There was only a gradual reinforcement of what had always been true. She could not imagine herself outside the system that had defined her, even if that system had been the source of her deepest losses, even if it had shaped her in ways that limited what her life could become. This is the nature of inherited structures. They do not require force to maintain themselves. They rely on familiarity, on the quiet alignment between expectation and identity, on the subtle transformation of obligation into something that feels, over time, like choice. And so, Caroline Kennedy continued, not as a reluctant participant, not as a visible victim, but as something more complex, a person who had been given just enough distance to appear free, but never enough to truly leave. The tragedy, then, is not that she failed to escape. It is that escape was never fully available to her in the first place, because long before the opportunity presented itself, the conditions that would have made it possible had already been shaped out of her. And what remains, in the absence of that possibility, is not regret. It is continuity, a life that moves forward, carrying with it everything it was taught to contain, without rupture, without release, without ever fully asking whether it could have been otherwise. Collapse, in some lives, is visible. It arrives with spectacle, public unraveling, irreversible mistakes, moments that can be pointed to and named. But in others, collapse is quieter. It does not announce itself. It integrates. By the time Caroline Kennedy entered her later roles, most notably as a diplomat representing the United States, there was no indication of fracture in the conventional sense. Her public presence remained consistent with everything she had always embodied: composure, restraint, control. She spoke carefully. She moved deliberately. She revealed nothing that could not be managed. From the outside, it was difficult to locate any sign of damage. And that, perhaps, is the most complete form of adaptation. Because when a person has been shaped to contain rather than express, collapse does not occur as a break. It occurs as a narrowing, a gradual reduction of emotional range, a life lived within boundaries so well maintained that they no longer feel restrictive. Her role as a representative of the United States, serving in a diplomatic capacity that required precision, discretion, and cultural sensitivity, aligned seamlessly with this internal structure. It demanded exactly what she had been trained, from childhood, to provide. control without visible effort, presence without exposure, engagement without vulnerability. She performed it well. Too well, perhaps, to invite scrutiny. Because effectiveness, in this context, can obscure the question of cost. What does it require to maintain this level of composure across a lifetime? What remains unexpressed in order for stability to appear uninterrupted? These questions do not produce immediate answers. They manifest instead in subtler ways, in the absence of spontaneity, in the careful calibration of every public interaction, in the sense that nothing is ever entirely unguarded. For Caroline Kennedy, this did not translate into isolation in the traditional sense. She maintained relationships, a family, a professional identity. She was not alone. But connection, when filtered through lifelong restraint, takes on a different quality. It becomes structured, predictable, safe, and safety, while necessary, can also limit depth. Because depth requires risk. It requires the possibility of revealing something that cannot be controlled, something that might disrupt the carefully maintained balance between image and interior life. In the Kennedy system, disruption has always carried consequences, and so it is avoided. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. Over time, this instinct becomes indistinguishable from personality. A person is described as private, reserved, composed, terms that suggest preference rather than conditioning. But preference implies choice. And choice, in this case, is difficult to isolate. Because the behaviors that define her adulthood were established long before she had the capacity to choose them. This is where collapse becomes most difficult to recognize. It does not appear as dysfunction. It appears as consistency. A life that proceeds without visible deviation. A narrative that remains intact. A person who fulfills every expectation placed upon her, not with resistance, but with quiet precision. And yet, beneath that precision, there is an absence. Not of achievement, not of stability, but of something less measurable. Unstructured emotional expression. Moments that exist outside of role. Experiences that are not filtered through expectation. It is possible that such moments existed, privately, beyond public view. But if they did, they were never allowed to redefine the broader pattern. The system held. And in holding, it absorbed everything. Even grief. Even repetition. Even the quiet accumulation of a life shaped more by inheritance than by deviation. This is not collapse as failure. It is collapse as containment. A condition in which nothing breaks, but nothing fully expands either, where the self remains intact, but only within the limits established long ago, where survival is achieved, but at the cost of something that cannot be easily named. And perhaps that is the final transformation of the Kennedy legacy as it lives within her. Not tragedy as spectacle, not loss as public narrative, but a form of endurance so complete that it leaves no visible trace of what has been endured. A life that continues, steady, controlled, uninterrupted. And in that uninterrupted continuity, a question lingers, not urgently, not dramatically, but persistently. If nothing ever breaks, how would you know what has already been lost? In the end, what remains is not a life that unraveled, but a life that never fully loosened its grip on what it was asked to carry. Caroline Kennedy does not stand as a figure of collapse, nor as one of escape. She exists somewhere quieter than both, in a space where continuity replaces resolution, and where identity is preserved more carefully than it is questioned. The world sees steadiness and calls it strength. It sees restraint and calls it dignity. And perhaps those interpretations are not wrong, but they are incomplete, because what remains is also the absence of rupture, the absence of a moment where the weight was set down, even briefly, even imperfectly. The absence of visible rebellion, of emotional deviation, of a life that risks becoming something unrecognizable to the system that shaped it. She carried the name. She carried the memory. She carried the silence. And in doing so, she ensured that the story would not end with her, but also that it would not fundamentally change. The Kennedy legacy, once defined by spectacle and loss, settles in her into something more enduring, and perhaps more difficult to see, a quiet preservation of everything that was never fully processed. No collapse, no release, only continuation. And somewhere within that continuation, a life that was always meant to represent something larger than itself, remains, still, just out of reach of being entirely its own.